Without Benefit of Clergy is a short story by Rudyard Kipling that really shows us the cost of the British imperial project in India, both to the British and Indians. The characters, as you know, John Holden, a civil servant living in bachelor quarters, Amira, his Muslim mistress. He has procured her and furnished a home for her and her mother, and for Tota, their son. This is what India looked like at a time right after the period of this story. The colorful cutouts are the princely states that are administered by native Indian rulers, indigenous rulers. The pink part of the diagram is the parts of India that were administered by the British. Again, think back to the East India Company from the early 1600s. In trying to make friends with Indian princes, the East India Company made sure that they offered any kind of service in return that the prince might need. That devolved into princes asking the British, both the East India Company, which was government sponsored, and the British Army to provide civil services. And what are we talking about when we talk about civil services? We're talking about the post office. We're talking about the law courts. We're talking about collecting taxes, witnessing marriages, any kind of activity that, keeping accounts of taxes, any kind of record-keeping activity the British were very, very good at. And they had a reputation for honesty. And so it's not surprising that the Indian princes basically hired the East India Company to administer their territories. As long as they got their cut off the top, they really didn't care that the East India Company was making a terrific profit, which is why they kept doing it. Again, so we see this, we see the civil service in action in those parts of India that are not ruled by other people. And it was the civil service's job to make sure that the people were taken care of. If there was famine, it was the job of the British administration, because they were working for India, basically. It was their job to make sure that the people got food. If they were sick, if there was a public health emergency, as frequently happened, mentioned in the story, famine, fever, and cholera, the British were obliged to report that to the government back home, but they were also obliged to deal with the emergency and try to bring doctors and medical supplies to where they were needed most. In fact, it's interesting to me that nature is described as a kind of civil servant. Nature began to audit her accounts with a red pencil, as though she were deciding whether there was a deficit in the red or a surplus. And so she's saying there's a deficit of deaths, I've got to kill some people. And therefore, I will send famine, I will send the plague of the disease cholera. If the civil service is this kind of enclosed, male-dominated world, how then does Holden meet Amira? Well, he prefers to set up his own mistress, probably for several reasons. The story doesn't really tell us. It does tell us that he fell in love with her after he had purchased her. Her mother, in fact, sells her, though he tries to tell Amira it was a dowry, it was a bride price. It really, what we see here is an indigenous woman being sold for sexual favors. There's no question that he's going to marry her in a legitimate fashion. They're of two different religious faiths. He's Christian, she's Muslim. That would discourage their actual marriage. But probably the biggest reason that he sets up a home with a mistress in it, not just that he is lonely for home and family, and he probably is, living with a bunch of other men is kind of rough, but he also would have had a fear of sexually transmitted diseases at a time when there was no real cure for those. And so having his own particular mistress meant he would avoid those other diseases that might be passed from various clients to the prostitutes. So so you might simply ask, why doesn't Holden just marry Amira then? If this is the case, why not just marry her? It would make sense for him to do that. They clearly love each other, but why no marriage? What's going on there? And in fact, we see that that early colonials were all single men. They were largely traders and sailors who would not, of course, have taken women on voyages with them. When missionaries were allowed into India, which would have been the 1815s, 1820s or so, when missionaries were allowed, they often brought their families with them, and the wives ministered to the Indian women who might be in purdah, that is to say, not able to see Western men. But this kind of cautious interaction between British and Indian women would have ended after the 1857 Sepoy Rebellion, also known as the Indian Mutiny, popularly. Again, that's the British term, not the Indian term. But this rebellion occurred very suddenly, very unexpectedly, and the British were very concerned that if their Indian so-called allies could turn on them so quickly, they just really could not trust Indians. And so that was a big reason for a distancing between the Indians, between the British who were living in India and the Indian elites, I guess I would say. The British just didn't trust these Indian people. In order to then avoid socializing with Indians, it was necessary to bring more British women out. And the East India Company, well, after the 1857, the East India Company was dissolved, and the British government actually ran an administration for any of the princely states that wanted Britain to administer for them. Again, the British got paid for doing that, and they got to do business as well, but they were doing it supposedly on behalf of the Indian rulers. But in order to maintain a British culture in India, and it isn't really considered a settler colony, the British who worked in India, even the married couples, would plan to come back to Britain to retire. Nobody wanted to settle in India. The climate was too difficult. But as far as working there, it was a way to make your fortune. And so-called the fishing fleet was women who answered the company's advertisement to come out to India and be companions, or be marriage material for the men who were there. Again, cementing British culture, providing a cultural community to keep the men happy and stable. And these women who had come out to India were really had a powerful influence over their men. And Kipling addresses this in one of his poems called The Female of the Species. And his tagline here is, the female of the species is deadlier than the male. Now, on the face of it, our feminist sensibilities rise up and we say, oh, that's horrible. But the fact of the matter is, it was the British women who were some of the harshest critics of Indian society. And, and certainly they're one of the main reasons what British women in the settlement would have said about him, and would have urged their husbands to blackball Holden if he had actually married Amira. And so, and Kipling, this is a complicated concept, but Kipling does a fair job, I think, of explaining it. She who faces death by torture for each life beneath her breast may not deal in doubt or pity, must not swerve for fact or jest. It's because women give life, give birth, that they have such a powerful incentive to take care of children, and they believe in bringing up their children in the British way. They don't want British children to learn Indian habits. Again, there's ethnocentrism there for sure. She can bring no more to living than the powers that make her great. What are those powers? That she, as the mother of the infant and the mistress. So her powers are to be mother and mistress, and when babe and man are lacking, and she strides unchained to claim. Okay, so again, think about the angel in the house. Think about separate spheres. The British woman in India influences her husband, tries to influence him in matters concerning British culture and her children in India. When babe and man are lacking and she strides unchanged to claim her right as femme and baron, her equipment is the same. She is wedded to convictions in default of grosser ties. Again, convictions, this is positing that women are emotional. They have convictions. It's not that they've reasoned this out. They have fixed ideas that are not going to change. So a woman is very fierce where it comes to her children. Heaven help him who denies the instant white-hot wild wakened female of the species, warring as for spouse and child. Again, Kipling, you can certainly say this is very sexist. He is seeing women as emotional creatures who simply are fighting for their children, kind of a natural response. And I'm not going to say that's not true, but I will say that, that is to say, I'm not going to say that's all bad, but it is certainly not an enlightened response that we would expect in the 21st century. The final stanza of the poem runs this wise. Knows, moreover, that the woman that God gave him must command but may not govern, shall enthrall but not enslave. So again, he's acknowledging that woman as the angel in the house does have a powerful effect on her husband. She is to bring a civilizing effect to husband and children. But he still disputes that she may enthrall but should not enslave him. And she knows, because she warns him, and her instincts never fail, that the female of her species is more deadly than the male. So another question you might have about the text is the business about that member for Tooting, member of Parliament who comes visiting, and why don't the civil servants take him a little more seriously? It's a good question. This man from back home, this British legislator, is wandering about India in top hat and frock coat, talked largely of the benefits of British rule, and suggested as the one thing needful the establishment of a duly qualified electoral system and a general bestowal of the franchise. His long-suffering host smiled and made him welcome. So what does he want? He wants the Indian people to have the franchise. The civil servants who live in India believe that would be chaos. They are, and the other thing about it, of course, is it would put them out of a job. So again, that's their ethnocentrism, believing that they certainly know better than the Indian people they're administering. If the Indians were so good at it, why aren't they doing it for themselves? Why did their rulers hire the British to take over? And again, because the British are entrenched now, it's hard to get rid of them. His long-suffering hosts, the other civil servants, smiled and made him welcome, and when he paused to admire with pretty picked words the blossom of the blood-red dock tree that had flowered untimely for a sign of what was coming, they smiled more than ever. Again, he really has no idea